안녕하십니까. 사회를 맡은 일본의 굴레 공동 번역자 윤영수라고 합니다. 평일 저녁 시간대임에도 불구하고 이렇게 이 자리에 와주신 여러분을 감사의 마음을 담아 환영합니다. 오늘 이 특별한 대담회를 이끌어가실 두 분을 먼저 소개해드리겠습니다. 일본의 굴레 저자이신 테가트 머피 교수님이십니다. 테가트 머피 교수님은 하버드 대학교에서 동아시아학과 경영학을 전공하고 체이스 맨하탄 아시아와 골드만삭스 재팬에서 근무하셨습니다. 그 후 브루킹스 연구소 개건연구원, 트쿠바 대학교 도쿄 캠퍼스에서 국제정치 교수로 역임하셨습니다. 일본의 굴레 이외에도 The Weight of the Yen, The Japan Policy Trap의 저서가 있고 현대 일본에 관한 활발한 저술 활동을 하고 계십니다. 다음은 주진형 선생님이십니다. 주진형 선생님은 서울대학교와 존스홉킨스 대학교에서 경제학을 전공하고 서울은행, 삼성증권, 우리투자증권, 한화투자증권 등에서 근무하셨습니다. 경제 알아야 바꾼다의 저자이시고 2000년도 테가트 머피 교수님과 만났던 인연으로 일본의 굴레 한국어판 추천 서문을 쓰셨습니다. 본격적인 대담을 시작하기에 앞서 제가 여러분께 질문을 하나 드리겠습니다. 오늘 오신 분들 중에서 일본의 굴레를 읽으신 분은 손을 한번 들어주십시오. 와, 감사합니다. 이 두꺼운 책을 읽어주셔서 너무 감사합니다. 여러분들은 이 일본의 굴레를 어떻게 읽으셨습니까? 저는 2014년 저희 가족이 일본 도쿄로 이사를 갔을 때 제가 일본을 굉장히 잘 안다고 착각했었습니다. 그런데 일본에 살면서 너무 답답하고 바로 이웃 나라이고 우리랑 너무 비슷한데 잘 모르고 있었다라는 것을 깨달았습니다. 그 나라의 어떤 면들을 매우 좋아하지만 어떤 면들은 도저히 이해할 수가 없었고 어떤 면들은 정말 마음에 거슬리는 부분들이 있었습니다. 그러던 와중에 이 책을 함께 번역한 공동 번역자인 박경환과 저는 이런 문제들이 이 책을 통해서 저희들이 고민하고 있었던 부분에 대한 답을 찾을 수 있었고 일본을 바라보는 시각도 깊고 넓어질 수 있게 되었다고 생각합니다. 그리고 놀랍게도 일본에서 벌어졌었던 일들이 한국에서도 똑같이 혹은 비슷하게 일어나고 있다는 사실을 알고 많이 놀랐습니다. 오늘은 테가트 머피 교수님과 주진영 선생님과 함께 이 책의 제목이기도 하고 이 책을 관통하는 주제이기도 한 일본의 여러 가지 굴레에 대해서 이야기를 나눠보고자 합니다. 그리고 두 분이 전공이 경제와 금융이십니다. 그래서 경제와 금융을 중심으로 해서 일본 사회에 미치는 영향과 그것이 세계 경제에 미치는 영향에 대해서도 이야기를 나눠보고자 합니다. 더 나아가 이것이 우리나라에 어떠한 의미를 가지고 있는지에 대해서도 이야기를 해보도록 하겠습니다. 대담의 말미에는 오늘 오신 여러분들께서 질문을 하시면 현장 질문을 받는 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 자, 그럼 본격적으로 대담회를 시작해 볼까요? 주진영 선생님께 마이크를 넘기겠습니다.
네, 안녕하세요. 잘 들리시나요? 뒤에서도? 네, 다행입니다. 얘기를 시작하기 전에 어떻게 할까에 대해서 좀 말씀을 드릴게요. 그저께 머피 선생님께서 경향신문에 인터뷰를 하는 자리에 제가 참관을 했어요. 왜냐하면 저도 한 분밖에 본 적이 없고 23년 만에 만나는데 무슨 말을 어떻게 하는지를 모르니까 옆에서 좀 들어보려고 그랬는데 그러면서 들은 느낌은 아무래도 저희가 잘 아는 부분을 갖고 얘기를 하는 것이 얘기가 겉돌지 않고 또는 피상적이지 않고 좀 더 깊은 얘기를 할 수 있을 것 같다. 그런 생각을 했고, 두 번째로는 제가 머피 선생님을 처음 알게 된 그 계기가 됐던 것이 The Weight of Yen이라는 책이었는데, 그 책에서 제가 이제 크게 느꼈던 것은 한국의 그 당시에 IMF 위기 이전에 돌아가고 또 IMF 이후에 돌아간 한국 시스템이 귀국한 지 얼마 안 된 저로서는 너무 이해하기가 어려웠는데, 한국에서 자란 사람인데도 이해하기가 너무 어려웠어요. 그랬는데 이제 그 책을 보면서 미국 사람이 본 일본 시스템이 어떻게 돌아가는지에 대한 설명을 듣고 비로소 제가 이해를 했어요. 인사이더의 프레임워크 설명을 하면 들어도 무슨 말인지를 모르겠죠. 그러니까 마찬가지예요. 뭐냐면 한국 시스템도 한국 사람의 눈으로 설명을 제 친구들한테 해보라고 그러면 들어도 제가 납득이 안 가는 거예요. 이게 어떻게 그렇게 되는 거지? 그렇게 했는데, 그런데 머피 선생님이 일본 시스템을 미국인의 눈으로, 그렇지만 미국에서 비즈니스를 하면서 알게 된 인사이더의 경험으로 설명을 하니까 비로소 아하, 한국의 시스템이 이렇게 돌아가는 건가를 내가 이제 이해를 했거든요. 그래서 저는 그 당시 그 책도 그렇지만 이 책의 가장 큰 장점은, 특히 이제 저 같은 사람한테는 한편으로는 객관적인 눈으로 또는 외부자의 시각에서 일본 시스템을 알지만, 그게 또 겨우 일본에 예를 들어서 뭐 3주 갔다 온 사람 또는 몇 년 갔다 온 특파원의 눈 정도가 아니라 일본에서 한 30년을 사는 사람의 눈으로, 한편으로는 아웃사이더의 시각을 갖고 있지만 또 한편으로는 내부자들은 어떻게 서로가 설명하고 있는지를 아는 사람이 쓰는 책의 장점이 이 책의 가장 큰 장점이 아닌가 이렇게 생각을 합니다. 그래서 이 말씀을 왜 드리냐면, 오늘 얘기하는 것의 주요한 포인트는 뭐냐면, 저는 한국의 경제발전 모델이나 중국의 경제발전 모델이나 대만도 다 마찬가지지만 일본의 모델을 데리고 왔어요. 기본적으로는 부채에 의해서 성장을 하는 것이고, 그 다음에는 내셔널 엘리트가 모든 걸 스테이트가 컨트롤해서 자원을 얼로케이트하는 그런 시스템인데, 이게 어느 정도까지는 성장을 하는데 그 소위 말하면 이제 그 성장의 그 성숙기에 달했을 때는 스위치를 해야 되는데, 레짐을, 그 체제를 스위치를 해야 되는데 어떻게 스위치를 할 거냐는 지금 모르는 거예요. 일본이 갖고 있는 문제도 그 문제고, 똑같은 문제를 한국도 지금 갖고 있는 거고 중국도 지금 똑같이 갖고 있는 거죠. 무슨 뜻이냐? 수출과 정부에 의한 투자, 과잉 투자에 의한 경제 성장을 어느 단계에서는 멈추고 국내 소비에 의한 총수요를 늘려서 경제 성장을 해야 되는, 어떻게 보면 시장에 의한 경제 성장을 해야 되는데, 그렇게 한다는 것은 말만 쉽지, 이게 소위 말하면 GDP에서 뭐 생산, 소비 이런 것만 보면 이렇게 소위 말하면 어카운팅 숫자를 바꾸는 것의 이슈가 아니라 그 뒤에 있는 사회 전체적인 모든 방식을 바꿔야 되는 숙제가 있는 거거든요. 근데 그걸 일본도 못 찾고 있고 한국도 못 찾고 있고 중국도 못 찾고 있는 거예요. 대표적인 예로 말씀을 드리면, 일본은 여전히 지금 지난 20년간 1%대의 경제 성장을 하지만 GDP 대비 투자의 비중이 25%인 나라입니다. 유럽이나 아니면 미국은 20%밖에 안 돼요. 근데 이 사람들은 5%나 더 많이 투자를 하는데 성장률은 더 낮아요. 한국은 32%입니다. 근데 요새는 우리가 지금 일본 꼴로 났잖아요. 1% 경제 성장하잖아요. 이게 무슨 말이냐면, 돈은 때려박는데 성장은 안 나오는 시스템인데, 그러니까 더 때려박는 거예요. 계속해서. 그 사이에 투자를 많이 한다는 뜻은 뭐냐면 국민들의 생활의 수준은 안 올라간다는 뜻인 거거든요. 이 트랩이 있는 것인데, 저는 그것을 이번에 머피 선생님이 만나뵈는 그거를 좀 얘기를 하고 싶어서 주로 그쪽으로 얘기를 할 거라는 걸 미리 말씀을 드리고, 그러한 앵글에서 질문도 계속해서 할까 합니다. 미리 이제 말씀을 드리는 겁니다. 오랫동안 기다려서 죄송합니다. 네. 전체적으로는 제가 그 질문의 플로우를 플라자 이후의 일본 경제의 흐름을 갖고 이제 따라가도록 해보겠습니다. 왜냐하면은 일본은 플라자 합의 이후부터 소위 말하면 이제 경제에 문제가 생기기 시작한 것이고, 한국은 그보다 조금 이후에 1998년에 금융위기, 내부적으로 금융위기를 겪으면서 그때부터 과거의 시스템을 더 이상은 운영할 수 없다는 걸 알았지만 새로운 시스템을 못 만들어내고 있고, 그 다음에는 이제 계속해서 그 문제를 지금 20년이 지나갔지만 여전히 해결을 못하고 있는 거거든요. 그런 면에서는 사실은 그 한국이 갖고 있는 문제의 원형은 일본에서 나왔다라고 저는 지금도 생각하기 때문에 주로 그 앵글에서 좀 여쭤보도록 하겠습니다. 네, 그러면 첫 번째 질문을 말씀을 드릴게요. 선생님께서는 그 책에서 그 얘기를 하셨어요. 그러니까 플라자 합의 이후에 그러니까 일본의 정책 당국자들이 엔화가 비싸지면서 수출에 타격이 오기 때문에 그것을 벌충하기 위해서 국내의 투자를 촉진시키고 싶었고, 그렇게 하기 때문에 어떻게 보면 이렇게 하면 버블이 생긴다는 것을 어느 정도는 알면서도 그것을 감내하고서는 시도를 했었다. 그러면서 결국은 이제 버블이 어느 정도 진행되고 난 다음에 이걸 버블을 터뜨리기로 결정을 했는데, 그러면서도 이제 그들이 믿었던 것은 뭐였냐면 그 소프트 랜딩을 자기네들이 매니지할 수 있다라는 생각을 했는데, 사실은 그것이 큰 미스테이크였다, 이게 실수였고, 그 결과로 일본은 장기적인 침체를 겪고 가장 큰 문제는 이제 막대한 정부 부채를 지게 되었다, 이제 그렇게 하셨잖아요. 근데 이 부분은 사실은 많은 사람들이 압니다. 그렇지만 제가 옛날부터 한번 만나뵈면 물어보고 싶었던 것은 뭐냐면, 그렇다 하더라도 왜 그 스태그네이션이 이렇게까지 오래 갔느냐라는 이슈입니다. 예를 들면 2008년에 세계적인 금융위기에서 버블이 꺼졌을 때도 미국이나 유럽도 역시 일시적인 GDP의 삭감을 겪었지만, 미국의 경우는 한 4년, 5년 뒤에는 오리지널 사이즈로 다시 회복을 했고, 유럽은 오스테리티 정책을 쓰는 바람에, 그러니까 긴축 정책을 쓰는 바람에 훨씬 더 회복은 늦었죠. 그렇지만 어쨌든 간에 한 10년 지나서는 원래 단계로 회복을 했는데, 일본은 원래 단계로 회복을 하는데 너무너무 오래 걸렸고, 플러스 그 이후에도 계속적인 스태그네이션을 20년, 30년 했단 말이죠. 왜 이렇게까지 오래 걸렸을까요?
Okay, let me. That's a very it's a very long and complex question. And before I start to try to answer it, I just want to say a couple of words. Thank you all for coming this evening, and I want also to use this opportunity to thank the translators of my book, Juan and Susan, who are sitting here, and Mr. Chu, who wrote a preface. If it hadn't been for their hard work, you would not have been aware of the book, or maybe been aware of me. And of course, I can't read Korean, so I don't know absolute certainty how wonderful their translation was, but many friends of mine who are Korean have told me what a great read it was, and so I'm very grateful for them, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak tonight. When you go back to the Plaza Accord, which was a response to pressure from the Reagan administration, the measures that had been taken early in the Reagan administration to effectively ended up blowing up the U.S. deficit, which was financed by Japan, largely financed by Japan. The effect of that, which any freshman economics student could tell you, was to drive the dollar to unprecedented levels, which became a huge political problem for the Republican Party and for the United States. And the Reagan administration had the notion that it was exchange rates and the soaring of the dollar against the yen were the principal cause for the deindustrialization of much of the United States, which was causing such political problems. So they put pressure on Japan, and Japan had had a generation in which any notion that strengthening the yen would weaken Japanese industry. They had been under that rubric for a generation, but there were people inside the Japanese government who were beginning to think that, maybe we shouldn't be hiding behind the weak yen. Maybe we need a stronger yen in order to subject the Japanese economy to a degree of discipline. The prime minister at the time, Nakasone Yasuhiro, was very much in support of that view. And so when the pressure came from Washington, the Japanese were prepared to respond to that pressure. And we got the Plaza Accord as a result. Now, the Plaza Accord did not accomplish its objectives. The U.S.-Japan trade deficit did not diminish. And when market players became aware of that in 1987, we got the New York stock market crash as a result. But in the meantime, the Japanese financial authorities and the Ministry of Finance and elsewhere had, as Mr. Chu suggested, taken measures to substitute for the exports that had been the driving force of the Japanese economy ever since the early years of post-war recovery, to substitute to substitute a wave of plant and equipment investment. And in fact, the real investment in Japan in the late 80s was the greatest wave of plant and equipment investment that the world had ever seen until that point. The view in Japan, again, one has to go back and put yourself in the mindset of 1985. It looked to the Japanese business and government elite that Japan was going to dominate pretty much every industry. Every industry that the Japanese had targeted from the early 1950s, when it was a matter of silk scarves and men's short-sleeve shirts and so forth, through steel, through shipbuilding, through copiers, through electronic equipment, automobiles, motorcycles, you name it. The Japanese had been able to establish a dominant position in that industry. So the view in Japan in 1985 was we're just a few industries left and Japan will become what is effectively the world's headquarters economy. Now, we can go into why that didn't happen. But in any case, the view was we will substitute a wave of investment for the exports that had been driving the economy. Now, and this was, there were a number of both monetary means, directions that were given to the banks to accomplish that, to finance that wave of investment. And as Mr. Chu said, when it was a matter of blowing bubbles, I'm not sure that's quite accurate, because in the sense that I don't think that they deliberately thought they were producing a bubble, because a bubble, of course, has within it the image that it's going to pop at some point. But they did certainly believe that they could control the how shall I put it, once the objectives had been accomplished to revive the Japanese economy, or to substitute investment for exports as the driving force of the economy, that they could achieve a soft landing. And as you mentioned in your question, they were not completely successful at that, I guess one could say. The Japanese, they lost control to a large extent of the financial system. It should be mentioned, however, that the Japanese financial elite, the Japanese financial authorities did accomplish something that was at that point unprecedented in global financial history. The implosion of the bubble economy, which happened in the 1990s, was the largest, I suppose you could say, the largest financial crisis in macroeconomic terms that the world had seen until the 2008-2009 crisis. And in history, there has never been a case of a banking system that has melted down that has become effectively bankrupt, which did not plunge the country in which it happened into a subsequent depression. That did not happen in Japan. And I think the reasons for that, even though the financial system was technically bankrupt, in the sense that the liabilities of the Japanese financial system exceeded the assets. But they were able to engineer what amounted to not exactly a soft landing, but something between a soft landing and a complete crashing of the Japanese economy along the lines of what we saw, for example, in 1931-32 in the United States with the onset of the Great Depression. They were able to accomplish that in part because most Japanese households and most corporate investors continued to keep their assets inside the banking system. There never was a complete bank run and loss of faith in the system. The closest that things came was actually in the fall of 1998, when several Japanese financial institutions effectively went bankrupt within a few weeks of each other. And that is a proximate cause of the Asian financial crisis, which of course then had such repercussions here in Korea. But the answer to the question of the measures that were taken to lift Japan out of that, I hesitate to say crash, but out of that stagnation, and why they didn't work as well as people hoped that they would work, at least the financial authorities hoped that they would work. First of all, there was sustained deficit spending, as you mentioned. I mean, in fact, Japan ran up the largest fiscal deficit in the world as measured as a percentage of GDP. But it was a stop and go effort. It was not consistent. And every time that there was the slightest sign that the corner had been turned, that this happened in 1996, that happened again in 2003, they quit. They would try to reduce the level of deficit spending, which had predictable results, and the economy immediately started to sputter. So it was, to some extent, it was a lack of consistency. And you might argue, well, didn't they have to do that? Because, I mean, at some point, wouldn't the deficit become unfinanceable? And this, of course, is a concern with the financial elite in Japan. What's often ignored is that the the fiscal deficit in Japan is so far financed entirely in Japan. Japan does not rely on the outside world for financing of its fiscal deficit. And you see scaremongers in Japan making comparisons with countries like Greece and Italy, which is completely nonsensical, because Greece and Italy do not control the currencies in which their deficits are financed. So the deficit is run in yen, and the primary holders of JGBs, Japanese government bonds, are Japanese households and corporates and financial institutions. So it's financed from inside Japan. I will say that you mentioned external events and how other countries managed to recover. You could argue that the period of real stagnation came to an end in the early 2000s, 20 years ago. And one of the primary, if not the most important reason for that, was the growth of the Chinese economy. And the Chinese economy importing large amounts of capital equipment from Japan in order to jumpstart the Chinese economy. That was a major factor.
That was also the major factor in Korean recovery.
Oh, sure. Yeah. No, it wasn't. I mean, you could argue that in some sense it was a major factor worldwide. And behind the scenes, you could also argue that the deficit spending by the George W. Bush administration to finance the Iraq War also had a major role, because, I mean, the U.S. market was suddenly sucking in as much goods and services from the rest of the world as it could because of the deficit spending. Much of that was coming from Japan, from China, from Korea. And those countries in turn were using the dollars that they earned from exports to the United States to purchase U.S. Treasuries, which allowed
So
the
you
whole
are
thing
saying
to
the initial bubble has stopped by the beginning of the
I think by that point, by the early 2000s, the Japanese banking system, the Japanese banking system had gradually grown out of its troubles. It was no longer technically bankrupt. The Ministry of Finance engineered a whole series of shotgun mergers. So all the major names of Japanese banking either disappeared or were merged into each other. Even historical rivals like, for example, Sumitomo and Mitsui, which were, different parts of the country, different historical roots, they were merged into the same financial institution. Industrial Bank of Japan, which is the crown jewel of Japanese bank, disappeared, effectively. So the Japanese banking system was merged, overhauled, and the balance sheet problems, it's de facto
But the
bankruptcy.
depression continued.
I'm sorry?
But the depression continued.
The deflation continued. The deflation and the depression continued. And I think it goes back to the reason why, to some extent, it has continued, goes back to what you were positing in your question, which is the inability or unwillingness to do what it takes to transform the Japanese economy from one in which the traditional engines of growth in first in exports and then in investment, where another engine comes into play, and that engine, of course, is domestic demand. But there is a reluctance in Japan to allow domestic demand to take the driver's seat, or rather, I should put it this way, to take the measures that would be necessary to put domestic demand in the driver's seat. And there are a whole host of reasons for that. Social, political, cultural, financial. If we, I could spend the whole evening talking just about that. But specifically financially, the Ministry of Finance is very narrowly focused on the challenge that Japan's fiscal deficit poses. The fear that they have, and it's a reasonable fear, is that the day will come when Japan will not be able to finance its fiscal deficit domestically, that it will have to rely on foreigners to finance the deficit in the way that, for example, the United States does. And that means at that point that Japanese JGBs, Japanese government bonds, will have to be competitive, which means that interest rates will have to rise to levels that make JGBs interesting to or attractive to foreign investors. And a rise in interest rates cannot be squared with the sustainability of the deficit. If the deficit rises if the interest rates rise to 3 to 4%, the numbers are frightening. So the Ministry of Finance looks at this. Any analyst could look at this and say, what can we do about this? And so the objective has been to reform the tax system in such a way that taxes will cover it. The problem is that if your principal economic challenge is domestic demand, taxes, of course, are a drag on domestic demand. And partly for political reasons, the Ministry of Finance and much of the political elite sees no real alternative to a widespread consumption tax. And the political and financial objective of the Ministry of Finance, that goes back a generation now, is to make a consumption tax the primary source of revenue for the Japanese government. And they see this as essential that this be accomplished before the day comes when Japan has to finance its fiscal deficit or its national debt from foreigners. The problem, though, of course, is that the consumption tax is arguably, for a country that suffers primarily from domestic demand, it arguably is the most suppressive of domestic demand. So that's just the financial. I mean, if you ask me, what's necessary is you take whatever measures you can to grow GDP as quickly as you can, as fast as you can. As long as GDP growth outstrips the growth of the deficit, you're okay. It's when GDP growth falls behind the growth of the deficit that you have problems. And right now, the U.S. is almost balanced at that point. But in the Japanese case, they're not yet there. And if they ask me, which they don't, but if they ask me, I would say economic policy in Japan ought to be governed by the overwhelming objective of raising domestic demand to as high a point as is possible. But it's the inability to do that, the inability to make that transition, which is one of the reasons why I think why Japan continues not exactly to, I mean, you know, the GDP growth rates, if you look at the macroeconomic numbers, and if you look at the comparisons of Japan with its peer economies, you know, Korea, Germany, you know, Britain and so forth, and Japan doesn't look that bad.
여러분은 이제 방금 말씀하시는 과정에서 느끼셨는지 모르겠는데 일본의 재무성이 처음에는 재정 적자를 통해서 경기를 부양을 해서 버블 붕괴로부터 빠져나오려고 했는데 항상 기회가 될 때마다 다시 재정 긴축으로 돌아가고 싶은 마음이 있었던 것이죠. 근데 잘 생각해 보시면 지금 한국도 앞으로 똑같은 그 디베이트를, 그 토론을 겪을 겁니다. 뭐냐면 한국은 지금 정부 부채가 GDP의 60%밖에 안 되지만 정부 관료들은 전체적인 경기나 또는 경제를 어떻게 키울 거냐 못지않게 재정 적자가 앞으로 어떠한 문제를 일으킬 거에 대한 걱정을 굉장히 많이 하죠. 이것은 어떻게 보면 일본의 경우에는 이게 정치 세력 간의 다툼으로 번지지는 않았지만 한국의 경우는 이것이 이제 정권 사이의 다툼으로 번지면서 자칫하면 비슷한 어떻게 보면 이제 딜레마 또는 비슷한 그 마비 상태에 갈 위험이 있지 않느라는 생각을 제가 하는데 지금 머피 선생님께서도 일본이 어떻게 보면 그러니까 피지컬 데피시트에 대한 걱정과 또 한편으로는 경제를 다시 살리고 싶어하는 의욕 사이에서 일종의 이제 장기적인 마비 상태가 온 것이 아니었나라는 그렇게 말씀을 하시는 것 같습니다. 다음 질문은 넘어갈까요? 그 두 번째로는 일본 기업에 대해서 여쭤보겠습니다. 이게 선생님께서는 그 책에서 그 버블 이코노미가 인플루드 하면서 엑스포 챔피언들도 마찬가지로 약화되었다. 이제 그렇게 얘기를 하셨고 인터넷 레볼루션에 따라가지를 못하면서 이제는 전 세계적인 그 경쟁을 할 수 있는 그러한 대기업들이 많이 이제 사라졌다. 이렇게 얘기를 하셨는데 또 한편으로 보기에는 제가 보기에는 인터넷 레볼루션에 따라서 새로운 대기업을 못 만들어낸 것은 유럽도 비슷하거든요. 그렇지만 유럽이 그렇다고 해서 일본처럼 장기적인 스태그네이션을 겪은 건 아니란 말이죠. 그래서 저는 일본 기업의 디클라인과 일본 기업의 쇠퇴와 버블 이코노미 사이에 어떤 관계가 있는 것처럼 말씀하셨는데 구체적으로 어떻게 영향을 준 것인지 아니면 일본 기업의 쇠퇴는 버블의 붕괴랑은 별도의 다른 이유를 갖게 된 것인지 그걸 좀 여쭤보고 싶습니다.
Well, I think there are several factors involved here. One is that the strategy that Japan put into place in the immediate post-war years, which they followed for 40 years, was effectively to target the market leader in a given industry. And then with the use of a panoply of tools that were at the disposal of the Japanese bureaucracy, including control of labor markets, control of foreign exchange, control of financing rates, high emphasis on quality, effectively to do what the foreign leader in that industry was doing, but to do it at a lower cost and higher quality. And it was a formula that worked. In fact, they even called it the Japanese miracle. And it was a formula that, of course, was followed here, followed to some extent in China, certainly in Taiwan. The problem with that formula is that once you reach parity in industrial structure with the world's leaders, and you could argue that Japan had reached parity by the early 1980s, who are you going to target? It's interesting that going back and looking at, industrial history, the target company that the Japanese managerial and political and financial elite had identified in the early 1980s was IBM. Just at the moment when the whole ground was going to shift underneath from the computer industry. Targeting mainframes as your next, the next sector that you're going to dominate. Well, it doesn't work anymore. So that was one, the end of models to follow. And the world was also, that was one thing, the world was also shifting from emphasis purely on manufacturing, on the quality and price of manufactured goods, to what you could call a mixture of manufacturing prowess and services. I mean, if you look at a company like Apple, for example, I mean, it's both a manufacturing company and a service company. And as I said in my book, I mean, one can praise Korea in the sense that, the Koreans were able to meet the challenge that Apple represented, and the Japanese were not. I mean, the mobile phone business, for example. I mean, the only serious challenger that Apple has worldwide is Samsung. Whereas the Japanese everyone, including me, in 1991, everyone expected Japan to dominate mobile phones. And they were blindsided first by Nokia, because Nokia offered a very cheap, disposable product, and then they were blindsided by Apple and Samsung. So, it was the move from not just manufacturing, but a mixture of manufacturing and services. That was the second reason. A third reason is the structure of Japanese finance. There is no real venture capital market in Japan. So it's very, very difficult for startups to find financing. I mean, I'm actually, partly for professional reasons and partly for personal reasons, I've invested in a Japanese startup run by some very, very brilliant guys. They're doing drone technology. And just to follow the difficulties that they're having in obtaining financing, I think they're going to do well. Otherwise, I wouldn't have invested in them. But the lack of sources of venture capital financing, also the lack of an effective M&A market in Japan, mergers and acquisitions market. Japanese companies, this goes back to what we were talking about in the earlier discussion. But if you look at where the great the savings in Japan, who are sitting, the government sector, the household sector, and the corporate sector. Historically, the household sector was the major provider of funds. If you go back, 40 years, the household sector is now relatively neither plus nor minus in terms of its funds position. The government, of course, is a net spender, far, largest fiscal deficit percentage terms in the developed world. The corporate sector is the primary provider of funds. Japanese companies are sitting like sleeping dragons on huge piles of cash, and there is they tend to be gun shy. They don't know what to invest in because the old rule of let's see what the Germans or the Americans are doing and copy that doesn't work anymore. They don't know what to invest in. They're very gun shy about that, and there is no real effective M&A market that would force them to do something with these vast piles of cash. And these vast piles of cash end up mostly in the JGB market. They finance the deficit. So it's up to the government then to spend. But when you have a government that that is allergic to spending, then you get the kind of situation that Japan is from a macroeconomic point of view. But you were asking more microeconomically. The fact that Japanese companies, so many larger Japanese companies, are so risk averse and just accumulate large quantities of cash rather than risking investment in new technologies, in new sources, in new enterprises. I mean, having said that, there are some hidden strengths in the Japanese economy, which I think are often not as recognized as they should be. It is certainly true that that Japanese companies have lost their cachet in a whole range of consumer products, consumer durables, electronic. The one great exception is automobiles, and even that, the automobile sector is under pressure, partly from here, partly from the U.S. now with Tesla and so forth.
You're talking about the Japanese hidden champions.
I'm sorry.
You are talking about the Japanese hidden champions.
The which one? The
hidden champions?
Yeah, I'm talking about the hidden champions, right? But there are a whole panoply of relatively small companies in Japan that very few people have heard of that have what amount to unassailable market positions in critical upstream components. The real question for the future of the Japanese economy structurally, first of all, is whether they can hang on to that, position, because they face great competitive threats in that from here, from Germany, now increasingly from China. So whether they can hang on to that position, but right now it's still very formidable. And the second question is whether that is enough to compensate for the weaknesses in the other parts of the Japanese economy.
아무도 일본의 소위 소재 산업에서 리딩 선도적인 기업이 있다라는 것을 부정하지는 않을 겁니다. 근데 말씀하신 것처럼 중요한 것은 그 산업만으로 일본의 코퍼레이트 섹터를 다시 부흥시킬 수 있겠느냐, 그게 이제 큰 이슈겠죠.
That really is. That is the question. And as I say, I mean, I'm repeating myself now, but that sector of the economy is still very, very strong. But whether it's enough to revive the entire economy is an open question now. And there's a third element I think that I probably should mention. And again, this is something where Korea can pride itself, because the Japanese have, without realizing it, they had a worldwide cultural appeal. Japanese, the anime and manga and all these forms of Japanese popular culture, without the Japanese even really being aware of it, they became very, very popular worldwide. But they couldn't figure out how to commercialize it. It didn't even occur to them to try to commercialize it. Whereas Korea, let's do it. So now you have, this boy band model, for example, which is something that was invented in Japan, was copied and perfected in Korea and made a worldwide commercial hit, which the Japanese failed to do. So, I mean, that's another, inability to sort of figure out how to capitalize on strengths that they actually do have in the services area. Tourism is an exception. The Japanese have done very well in developing a major tourism sector, which 20, 30 years ago did not exist. Tourism is an exception. But outside of tourism, they've failed to do that.
제가 보기에는 이런 면이 있는 것 같습니다. 뭐냐면 말씀하신 것처럼 이제 80년대 말에 정도 되면은 일본의 제조업이 경쟁력이 세계의 최상위 수준까지 갔는데, 문제는 이제 그 다음부터 계속해서 그러면 그 물건을 계속해서 팔면서 더 이상 소위 말하면 석권할 산업이 점점 없어지면, 그러면 결국은 서비스 섹터라고 우리가 보통은 말하지만, 그게 서비스 섹터가 꼭 무슨 맥도날드 서비스만 있는 것이 아니라 부가가치가 높은 서비스 산업도 있는데, 그것으로 넘어가기 위한 능력이나 준비는 못 갖고 있었던 것이 결국은 자기의 매니팩처링 섹터 자체의 발목을 잡는데 영향을 준 것은 아니었나, 이제 그런 생각을 선생님 말씀을 들으면서 듣는데, 어떻게 보면 우리도 사실은 그 문제가 있는 것이죠. 근데 그게 사실은 말이 그렇지 여러분들도 아시다시피 일본의 제조업 분야의 생산성은 미국에 비해서 뭐 90% 정도가 되는데 서비스 산업의 생산성은 미국의 뭐 50%밖에 안 된다는 얘기는 20년 전부터 나왔지만 그 갭이 안 준단 말이죠. 근데 똑같은 문제를 한국도 갖고 있습니다. 근데 이것은 뭐냐면 꼭 그게 뭐 컬처럴 이슈가 아니라 그 사람을 어떻게 길러내고 사람의 그 창조력 있는 인간을 길러내느냐, 어떻게 보면 이제 에듀케이션 시스템이라고 할 수도 있고 문화적인 어떠한 그 개인의 창조성을 인커리지한 또 이제 고양하는 그러한 체제로 우리가 못 갈 경우에는 결국은 일본이나 한국이나 마찬가지로 서비스 산업의 생산성 향상을 기대하기는 어렵지 않을까 그런 생각을 하게 되네요. 네, 그럼 다음 질문으로 넘어가겠습니다. 다음에는 선생님께서는 레이버 마켓에 대한 얘기를 코퍼리 섹터 얘기할 때 하셨는데 전후 일본에서 굉장히 중요했던 그 사회적인 통합, 그 통합은 주로 종신 고용을 통해서 이루어졌는데 그것이 점점점 위협을 받고 격차 사회가 되고 그러고 있다라는 그런 얘기를 하셨어요. 그러면서 그 결과적으로는 그 소수의 노동 규적이 좋은 직장을 유지를 하고 나머지 많은 사람들은 점점점 저임금의 비정규직 노동으로 이제 몰려가고 있다. 이제 이것이 결국은 일본에서 점점 소위 말하면 격차 사회라는 현상을 만들어내고 있다. 이제 그렇게 얘기를 하셨는데 이 문제가 결국은 어디에서 어떻게 푸는 것이 바람직한지 또는 과연 일본이 그 문제를 해결할 거라고 보시는지 그것에 대해서 듣고 싶습니다.
Yeah, very interesting question, and if I could have the answer to that, it might be Ajiro in Tokyo. It actually bears. The answer partly lies in your summing up of the previous question when you noted that productivity in the service sector in Japan is so much lower than it is in the States. Now, I'm an American, and I moved after living in Japan for many years. I moved back to the States at the end of 2019. I was intending to go back to Japan regularly, but because of COVID, I couldn't for nearly 3 years. Yes, it's true that the productivity of the American service sector is very high. That has come at huge social cost in the U.S. The pressure on wages in the U.S. And the kinds of lives that people, in the restaurant business, for example, and so forth, are required to live in the U.S. is one of the principal reasons for this terrible divisiveness in American society. The U.S. has been, is perhaps more divided now than it has been since the 1850s. And the outlook is fairly grim. The Japanese have deliberately placed social cohesion, and you did allude to that, as a goal that is as important as economic prosperity. Now, the two go together in one sense. It's very difficult to have social cohesion when you don't have economic prosperity. And similarly, it's very difficult to have economic prosperity if you don't have a degree of social cohesion. It bears you referred to the lifetime employment system, and it bears remembering that even though Japan today is an outlier among the developed countries, countries like Korea, the United States, France, Britain, are bitterly divided countries politically. Japan has very little obvious, that kind of deep, bitter political divisions. You just don't see that. But that was not true in the 1950s. There was a very, very powerful left in Japan. Unions were radical. The communist and socialist parties had huge followings. And there was what amounted to a settlement of all of the labor troubles, and I devote a good deal of writing in that in my book, in the late 1950s, to buy labor peace to an extent. Major Japanese corporations offered what amounted to lifetime economic security for their core male employees. Now was called lifetime employment, but it was more a matter of providing economic security. Rather than Europe faced a somewhat similar challenge. Europe went down the route of welfare state. Effectively, we have a welfare state that will buy social peace. In Japan, it was a welfare state. You could call it a welfare state, except that the agents of delivering the welfare were corporations rather than the government. And of course, formal lifetime employment protocols only applied to major Japanese corporations, but even smaller companies would attempt to follow it. A smaller company that started to fire people would immediately be suspect. They must be in financial trouble, or otherwise they wouldn't fire people. So the pressure, it was legal pressure from the labor ministry, but it was also social and economic and financial pressure. When you offer somebody a job, you keep them unless there's some great reason for their resignation. Now, this made perfect sense in the Japan of the 1950s. You pay young men entering the companies far less than they're worth. But the promise is, we'll take care of you for the whole rest of your lives. And with the demographic pyramid that Japan had in the 1950s, small number of senior people, lots of younger people, it made a lot of sense. It has not made sense for a generation now. And what you see is two things. One is you see the beneficiaries of this lifetime employment model that came out of the labor troubles of the 1950s. The current beneficiaries of that, who are people our age and slightly younger, are very much trying to hang on to their privileges. There's still an enormous pressure not to let people go, although Japanese companies have tried in various ways to relieve that kind of pressure. And the second thing is that Japanese companies have become very, very chary of offering that kind of employment security to the younger generation, and to turn instead to so-called temporary workers, who are often not temporary at all, but they're hired by temp agencies and so forth. They often have the same job responsibilities, but they're paid much less. This has been accompanied by widespread, coming into the workforce of women. The women were in the workforce in Japan in the 1950s, but they typically, once they got married and were pregnant with their first child, the woman typically left the company. Maybe older women would sometimes come back. But this has been changed now. But the kinds of jobs that many women are taking now in Japan are not management track jobs, but are effectively temporary. They're called temporary, but they do not benefit from lifetime employment protocols, and they can be paid considerably less. Women and also more and more young men can no longer look forward to those kinds of lifetime employment, lifetime economic security, tacit promises. There has also been controlled immigration. The Japanese look at what's happened in the United States, what's happened in Germany, where immigration has become a hot political issue, and they determined not to let that happen in Japan. Now, that's easier in a country like Japan that is an island country. You can't, get in a boat and float to Japan like you can to Italy, not to mention cross a river like you can in the U.S. if you want to go from Mexico to the U.S. But the notion that Japan has no immigrants is false. They have plenty of immigrants. It's just that the immigration is very tightly controlled, and they make up some of the lowest tier in the service economy, and also the baseboard of the manufacturing economy. You know, the supplier to the supplier to the supplier. Many of you have probably been to Tokyo or Osaka recently, and if you go into a kombini, a 7-Eleven or someplace, the likelihood is that you'll see very, very strong likelihood you'll see somebody from Nepal who will take your order. But that Nepal or someplace like that. But that is controlled. But the combination of, you know, bringing a lot of women into the labor force, among other things, this exacerbates the demographic challenge. Bringing a lot of women into the labor force, not offering young men the kinds of contracts that they were offered a generation ago, and using relatively low-paid immigrant labor. It gets back to our domestic demand problem. Where's domestic demand going to come from? I mean, if you are in a job which you may not have next month, in which you're not paid very much, are you disposed to spend much money? I mean, the answer to that is obviously no. So it exacerbates the problem of domestic demand. So far, though, it has not become a political problem in the way that I started my response to your question by talking about the situation in the States. It has not become a political problem the way it has in the United States. It could become one. That is to say, and you know, the last and only real challenge to the political alignments, the power structure that solidified in the late 1950s in Japan. It is sometimes called the 1955 system because that was the year that the Liberal Democratic Party was founded. The only significant challenge to the LDP rule occurred in 2008-2009 when the Democratic Party of Japan won in a landslide election and controlled at least the Prime Minister's office and the Diet for 3 years. And they had explicitly campaigned with the promise to substitute what amounted to a Northern European kind of welfare state for corporations as the primary agents in providing for economic security. They failed. And there's no significant political challenge on the horizon now to the current political alignments. That doesn't mean it couldn't happen.
But they failed not because of the idea of
They didn't
welfare
fail because
state.
of that. They
Right.
failed for other reasons.
Right.
They failed for other reasons. Yeah, you're right about that. Although I must say that again, I mean, they waffled. They were initially elected partly on a campaign against the consumption tax, and they waffled on that. And in fact, the last of the three prime ministers, DPJ prime ministers, Prime Minister Noda, completely flipped, completely reversed himself. And the electorate was so disgusted that they threw him out of office. And Abe became prime minister in his wake.
그래서 말씀을 듣다 보면은 이제 그런 생각이 들 때가 많아요. 뭐냐면 여러분들도 아시다시피 한국과 일본은 중에 이제 미국 시스템을 특히 텍스와 재정 지출에 있어서는 미국 시스템을 갖고 왔는데 그것은 뭐냐면 텍스 버든은 GDP에서 한 20% 정도 되고 지출도 그 정도 되니까 결국은 웰페어 스테이트로 안 가는데 미국의 경우는 그 모델이 시장 경제에 의해서 나머지가 돌아가는 시스템인데 일본과 한국은 사실은 시장 경제에 의해서 돌아가는 시스템도 아니면서 재정 구조는 미국 시스템을 갖고 왔단 말이죠. 그러니까 당연하게 웰페어가 안 되는 것이고 성장이 안 되는데 그 문제를 그러면은 일본의 민주당은 10몇 년 전에 유로피안 스타일의 웰페어 스테이트로 가려고 말은 했지만 다른 이유로 결국은 무너지고 난 다음에 다시는 이제 못 일어서고 있지만 결국은 일본이나 한국이나 어떻게 이 장기적인 침체에서 나올 거냐라는 것에서 도메스틱 디맨드 말씀을 하셨지만 사실은 그것은 어떻게 미국의 모델에서 유럽의 웰페어 스테이트로 넘어갈 수 있느냐라는 숙제랑도 어떻게 보면 연결이 되어 있는 건 아닐까라는 생각을 합니다. 뭐냐면 도메스틱 디맨드, 그러니까 하우스홀드에, 그러니까 가구의 소비를 어떻게 누가 보충을 할 거냐라는 문제에서 유럽이 갖고 있는 모델은 부담은 많지만 지출도 많이 하는 구조로 갖고 미국은 부담도 적지만 지출도 적은 시스템인데 한국과 일본은 그것에 대한 사회적인 그 분쟁의 소지를 기업 부분에 의한 웰페어를 통해서 풀었다가 이제 그것이 경제 위기를 거치면서 기업 부분에서 그걸 해줄 수가 없게 되면서부터는 기업은 자기네들이 살기 위해서 조그마한 정규직 말고 나머지는 점점점 일을 비정규직으로 몰아내는 이 과정에서 그러면 이것을 어떻게 풀어나갈 거냐라는 숙제를 일본이 못 풀고 있다는 문제가 결국은 한국도 똑같은 문제를 보여주는 게 아닌가 그런 생각이 듭니다. 그런 면에서 그러면 일본은 이 이렇게 그 노동 시장이 이중화돼 있고 격차 사회가 되는 것에 대해서 왜 정치적으로 이 문제가 플레어 포인트로 작용을 하지 않을까요? 왜 이것이 논점으로 정치적인 문제가 되지 않을까요? 한국은 이미 문제가 되어 있는데.
Well, as I say, I mean, it was the DPJ, the Democratic Party, which won the 2000, I guess the election was the end of 2008, and they took over in 2009. That was an explicit part of their platform, was to address that. And as we already indicated, they failed. The Kante, the Prime Minister's office under Abe, has made periodic efforts to nudge Japanese corporations to raise their wages and to offer more in the way of economic security. The problem is that it hasn't been, I guess you could say, it hasn't been strong enough. It's mostly a matter of persuasion and hectoring, but it hasn't been backed up by sufficient sanctions against corporations that refuse to raise wages or refuse to offer much in the way of economic security. And if you were to ask me why that's the case, I think it's that it's the answer is not completely clear. Partly it's because the corporations are, after all, the ones that provide for Japan's economic well-being. So there's fear of putting too much pressure on Japanese corporations to address this problem. And then there's also the links, I think, the unspoken links between major corporations and the bureaucracy. So there's what you end up with is a good deal of hectoring on the part of the elected political leadership. Now and again, I mean, I remember a few years ago that the governor of the Bank of Japan, Kuroda, was actually a spasm of almost real anger at Japan. Here I've flooded the country with money. Now, why don't you do something with this money and raise wages? And they weren't raising wages enough. So now and again, you get these spasms of anger. But what sort of sanctions are they going to apply to companies in order to force them to raise wages or to offer more in the way of economic security? And at the same time, the Ministry of Finance is dead set against any kind of explicit social welfare commitments that would be beyond what they already have. I mean, already, for example, Japan has one of the world's best, in terms of medical outcomes, national health plans. But it's very expensive, and it's becoming more expensive with an aging society. And the Ministry of Finance is very worried about that, as they might well be. And so to increase Social Security in Japan, I mean, the provision for older people is a fraction of what it is even in the States, not to mention what it is in Europe. So there's this fear inside the economy, well, we can't afford that. We can't afford public sector welfare, and there's a limit to the amount of pressure we can put on companies to have companies handle that welfare problem. So that's sort of where things end up.
여기서 조금 이제 제가 느끼는 것을 말씀을 드리면 지금 선생님께서 그 책에서 그 얘기를 하셨는데 아베 정권처럼 대기업들한테 임금을 올리라고 프레셔를 줘봤자 그것은 어떻게 보면은 투티어 시스템을 더 악화시키는 결과만을 가지고 올 수 있다. 그 사람들이 말을 듣느냐 아니냐를 떠나서 그런 얘기를 그 책에서 하셨는데 그거와 비슷한 게 이제 한국에서 문재인 정권이 들어서자마자 공공부문의 정규직을 늘리겠다는 식으로 얘기를 했잖아요. 이거 어떻게 보면 비슷한 말하자면 고민을 다르게 표현을 하는 거라고 봅니다. 그 당시에 문재인 정부에서는 아니 공공부문의 정규직을 늘린다고 해봤자 그게 전체 고용에서 2천만 중에서 당신들이 늘릴 수 있는 게 몇 명이 된다고 20만이면 결국은 1%지 않습니까? 그러니까 그랬더니 이제 그 당시에 제 기억에 그 김상조 씨가 TV에 나와가지고서는 그 당시에 그들이 좋아하던 표현이 있습니다. 마중물이라고. 그래서 저는 그 말을 들으면서 참 말장난을 정치를 들어가더니 금방 말장난하는 걸 배웠구나 싶었던 것이 공공부문의 정규직을 늘리는 게 어떻게 민간 부분의 정규직을 늘리는 메커니즘으로 작용할 수 있는지 아무리 생각해도 안 나오는 거거든요. 그러니까 결국은 비슷한 문제를 갖고 있는데 한국은 거기에 대한 정치적인 프레셔를 공공 부분의 정규직을 좀 늘려보다가 이제 두드려 맞고 지금 쑥 들어갔고 일본은 대기업한테 임금을 좀 올리라는 식으로 갔는데 그게 말이 좀 되는 게요. 한국은 왜 그렇게 못하느냐면 한국의 대기업의 정규직은 일본의 대기업 정규직보다 훨씬 월급이 높습니다. 그렇기 때문에 한국에서는 대기업 정규직한테 월급을 더 올려줘라는 말을 차마 할 수가 없는 거예요. 국민들이 다 알기 때문에. 그런 좀 차이가 있습니다.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
다음 퀘스천으로 넘어갈게요. 이것은 완전 방금 말씀하신 걸 좀 이제 아벤으로 넘어가기 전에 잠깐 중간에 말씀을 드릴까 하는데 뭐 선생님께서도 아무래도 이제 파이낸셜 섹터에서 일하셨기 때문에 일본 은행의 특징에 대해서 여러 번 말씀을 하셨는데 버블 이후에 은행들이 망하고 합병하고 많은 회사가 없어지고 난 다음에 일본의 파이낸셜 섹터는 과연 그들의 그 과거에 했던 행동 패턴을 바꿨나요? 크레딧 리스크나 이런 거 생각 안 하고서 막 빌려주던 것들을 이제는 그렇게 안 합니까? 아니면 여전히 비슷합니까?
They became, alas, more conservative. Before the events of the 1990s, Japanese banks did not do what at least Western financial institutions would regard as rigorous credit analysis. Money was lent on two bases. One was on the basis of how well connected a potential borrower was in the Japanese system. A company with Mitsubishi or Sumitomo or Mitsui or whatever in its name. One that whose senior management were graduates of the major Japanese universities. One that had an established position. One that had plenty of retired bureaucrats in their senior management ranks. You would lend to them because the notion that this company would not would default on its loans was just unimaginable. I mean, if they were in a position where they might default on their loans, they would be supported one way or another by other companies in the business group or by, the bureaucracy would organize cartels or what have you. So they didn't worry about that. So they didn't do that kind of credit analysis. And the second thing was that companies that weren't that well connected had to provide collateral. And the gold standard for collateral was real estate. If you had piece of land in central Tokyo that was worth more than the loan that you were asking for, fine, no questions asked. Well, in the 1990s, two things happened. One is that the unimaginable occurred, which is that the value of real estate fell. Real estate prices in Tokyo fell to, during that decade, to half or less, even in some cases much, much less than they had been. The second thing that happened was that the even well-connected companies failed. I used to write fairly often, I think I mentioned it in the book, on the bankruptcy of the Sogo department store in 2000, I think it happened in 2002. The Sogo department store was a second-tier department store. Wasn't like Isetan or Mitsubishi. But it was nonetheless, the Industrial Bank of Japan was its main bank. And it never occurred to anybody that they could go bankrupt. Well, the fact is they had been technically bankrupt for 10 years. But in IBJ, Industrial Bank of Japan, said, we can't support them anymore. They went bankrupt. And the headlines in the Japanese papers were the equivalent of, headlines, major earthquakes that were laying waste to whole cities, or, outbreaks of huge wars. Because this was effectively the end. This was, and they were deserved, because what those headlines signified, this is the end of post-war Japanese finance, where well-connected companies have effectively unlimited access to credit that is continually rolled over. So what happened? The banks are merged, as you indicated. Nobody actually lost it. Lifetime employment protocols continued to hold. I mean, bankers at the banks, they may have been retired early, but they continued. They didn't end up on the street, begging. They didn't become beggars. But careers were ruined. In some cases, they were even, in a few cases, foreigners were allowed in to buy up certain financial institutions. They ended up reporting the humiliating position of reporting to foreigners younger than they were. So the result was that the banks became even more conservative, in the sense that only the best connected and the most financially robust corporations, companies that didn't need money, were the only ones who could get it. And so what did the banks do with all of these vast amounts of money that was pouring in through depositors and so forth? They bought JGBs, Japanese government bonds. And this is, again, I alluded to this a little earlier when I was talking about, the lack of a venture capital market and how that affects investment in Japan. But the banks have become, if anything, as I say, have become more conservative than they were. And, this is not good. This is not good for the long-term future of Japan. Particularly, the world has moved to, if you perfectly well know, if you look at the structure of global finance, whether it's Europe, the States, or whatever, commercial banks have become less important as providers of both working capital and investment capital to industry, and securities markets, and have become much more important. And there are all kinds of reasons behind that. Computerization is certainly one of them, but it's not the only one. But Japan has, I guess you could say, has failed completely to make that transition, even though there has been talk about it for a generation. Back in the late 1990s, they had this, what they called the Kiyu Big Bang, this big bang of Japanese finance, where they were supposed to redo the whole Japanese securities market, secured structure of Japanese securities, equity markets. And, it turned out to be basically to fizzle out. So there's been a failure to make that transition to a market or a financial system that relies more on direct as opposed to indirect financing. But in the meantime, you still have very, very conservative Japanese banks. So it's a huge structural challenge for Japan, which fits also then the macroeconomic challenges that the country faces.
말씀을 듣다 보면은 한국과의 이제 차이가 드러나는 것이 뭐냐면, 일본의 은행은 과거에 서로 정치인 연줄이 됐든 옛날에 서로 아는 사이가 됐든 그런 걸로 해서 신용 위험을 생각 안 하고 돈을 빌려주다가 그것이 버블이 꺼지고 난 다음에는 은행 자체가 부실이 커지면서 그 일을 더 이상 못하게 됐고, 그래서 이제 더 컨서버티브니까 이제 더 조심스러워졌다는 결국은 그 얘기는 GDP에서 그러니까 코프리 섹터에 대한 대출의 비중이 이제 적어졌다는 말씀일 겁니다. 통계적으로 나타나면 한국은 어떻게 됐냐면은 IMF 위기 이후에 대기업의 은행의 의존도는 낮아졌지만 그 대신에 중소기업과 가계에 대한 대출이 차지하는 비중은 훨씬 더 커졌거든요. 일본은 그렇게 되진 않았습니다. 그래서 우리는 덕분에 일본보다 98년 경제 위기 이후에 더 높은 경제 성장률을 달성했는지도 모르죠. 일본은 기본적으로 경제 성장을 하는 데 있어서 뱅크 크레딧이 팽창을 하지 않으면서 성장할 수는 없는 거거든요. 근데 만약에 뱅크가 크레딧을 늘리지 않는다고 하면은 그 누가 무슨 짓을 하려고 해도 경제는 못 알아가는데 한국은 대기업에 대한 랜딩은 늘리지 않았지만 대신에 그것을 중소기업과 이제 가게한테 대출해줬는데 제가 97년에 한국에 들어왔을 때 가장 놀랐던 것 중에 하나가 뭐였냐면 우리나라에서는 은행에서 돈을 빌려가지고 원금을 갚는 차주가 굉장히 드물어요. 대기업만이 아니고 중소기업도 그렇고 가게도 그렇습니다. 이자만 갚지. 그리고 이자가 만기가 되면 다시 또 원금을 또 차환하고 만약에 원금을 중간중간에 갚아서 크레딧 리스크를 줄이는 프랙티스를 만약에 일본이나 한국이 한다고 하면 아마 은행의 대출은 우리나라처럼 이렇게까지 커질 수가 없었을 거예요. 그래서 제가 항상 느끼는 것은 일본은 은행이 대규모로 망하면서 정부가 돈을 넣어줬다고 하지만 그 이후에 지금처럼 한국처럼 다시 방만한 대출로는 가지는 못한 것 같은데 한국은 사실은 제가 보기에는 중소기업과 가게에 대한 방만한 대출을 새롭게 창출하는 쪽으로 가지 않았나 그런 생각을 할 때가 있습니다.
Yeah, I should mention also that you know, in the 1950s and 1960s, even as late as the late 70s, Japanese corporations were even the largest and most famous and you know, companies, well-established companies, were reliant on banks for working capital financing, and that sometime in the 1970s, early 1980s, major corporations basically they needed their banks less and less. Retained earnings were providing a sufficient financial cushion so that they could look to that for their financing requirements. And as you pointed out in Korea, what struck me was that effectively, historically, bank loans were just rolled over in Japan. You said that's the situation here. They were rolled over. Companies weren't ever asked to pay down principal. They were just, their loans were endlessly rolled over. So as long as the interest payments were made, which of course was easy to do during the high growth years, then there was never any pressure to pay down principal. And that whole situation began to shift well before even the bubble economy, when corporations had sufficient retained earnings, and banks didn't know how to do credit analysis. How do you lend to SMEs? How do you lend to households? And they made some, in retrospect, poor decisions, which blew up in their faces during the aftermath of the collapse of the bubble, which also exacerbated the conservative tendencies.
그 중소기업 랜딩을 보면서 제가 느끼는 건 제가 보기엔 일본도 마찬가지라고 생각을 해요. 왜냐하면 일본 드라마를 보면 그런 얘기가 자주 나오니까 뭐냐면 중소기업 랜딩을 하는 데 있어서 우리나라 은행들이 갖고 있는 커다란 그 장애는 뭐냐면 그 기업의 회계 장부를 믿을 수가 없다라는 거예요. 그러니까 일본 은행이나 한국 은행이나 부동산 담보를 그렇게 중요시하게 되는 가장 큰 이유는 그 기업의 파이낸셜 스테이트먼트를 제대로 믿을 수가 없으니까. 그런데 그거 맨날 우려해봐서 소용이 없으니까 그러면 확실한 부동산 담보라도 잡자라는 쪽으로 가게 되는 것이고 실제로 우리나라의 지금 중소기업 대출이 IMF 위기 이후에 지금까지 끊임없이 늘어나는 큰 배경은 그동안 우리나라는 일본과 다르게 부동산이 계속해서 값이 올라가기 때문에 그렇기 때문에 중소기업들이 담보로 부동산을 제공할 수 있는 여력이 점점 커졌기 때문에 크레딧이 오른 면이 있습니다. 그런데 일본은 그 부동산 값이 내려갔기 때문에 중소기업이 담보로 제공할 수 있는 그 가치 자체가 줄어든 것도 아마 영향을 주지 않았을까 그런 생각을 합니다.
Yeah, I will say this, that at least in the urban areas, particularly in Tokyo, real estate prices have stabilized and have begun to climb again. So that may change things in the next. We'll see. Yeah.
지금 법사 선생님이 말씀하시는 게 뭐냐면 일본의 부동산 값이 내려간 건 여러분들도 아시지만 최근 한 10년 사이에 도쿄 도심과 그 다음에 이제 오사카라든가 이런 식으로 대기업, 그러니까 대도시의 중심부의 부동산은 다시 올라가기 시작을 했고 그것이 조금씩 다른 부분으로도 지금 번지고 있습니다. 그래서 최근에 제가 알기로는 2021년, 22년 이때부터는 그리고 최근에는 일본의 전국 평균 지가가 조금 올랐어요. 한 1% 정도. 이것도 이제 일본 신문에서는 뭐 20년 만에 처음이니까 30년 처음인데 이런 식으로 얘기를 하는데 그것이 어떻게 보면 충분히 내려갔기 때문에 그 다음부터 이제야 30년 후에 또는 20년 후에 이제 올라가는 것 아닌가 그런 생각이 듭니다. 네, 그 다음 질문을 드리면은 아베 이코노믹스 물론 이제 아베는 이미는 끝났지만 아베 이코노믹스를 아베가 지금 한 8년 동안 재임을 하면서 얘기를 했는데 뭐 돌이켜보면 별로 퍼포먼스가 좋지는 않았죠. 왜냐하면 예를 들면 뭐 2010년부터 19년 사이에 일본의 경제 성장률은 평균적으로 연간 10.3%였습니다. 거기에 비해서 한국은 같은 기간에 3.3%였고요. 1.3%라니까 좀 기억나시나요? 요새 우리나라 기업 1.4% 얘기하는 거. 왜 아베의 경제 정책은 실패했을까요? 또는 아베가 무슨 짓을 했어도 아무렇게나 실패를 했을까요?
Well, I'm not sure that they completely failed. I mean, first of all, economic policy was never Abe's primary. That wasn't what got him out of bed in the morning. And you know, he had been prime minister back in 2006, and it was a failed administration. And people, you know, wrote him off. They thought he resigned to the political wilderness, never came back. And when he came back in 2012, he campaigned. He was advised that he had to campaign as a reformer and as somebody who would revitalize the Japanese economy. And as you probably know, he advertised three arrows: fiscal policy, monetary policy, and structural reform. And these would revitalize the economy. Well, the only one that really ended up mattering was monetary policy. The structural reform, which we were talking about this earlier in terms of wages, was mostly hot air, mostly talk, which didn't go very far. There's some little bits here and there, but not very much. Fiscal policy, the numbers looked large, but when you started to take them apart, you realize that there isn't really much in the way of fiscal stimulus going on. Monetary policy, on the other hand, was significant. I mean, Abe brought in Mr. Kuroda as the governor of the Bank of Japan. He was a disciple of the American economist Irving Fisher, who believed that the proper response to stagnation was basically to flood the economy with money until the economy started reviving. And that's what Kuroda did. And that accomplished what Abe, I think, actually wanted, which was to give him the political space to start implementing measures that really mattered to him. I mean, overhaul of Japan's security policies, overhaul of its foreign relations, and increasing some, if you want to put it this way, the rightist control in Japan. Now, that's not what we're talking about this evening, because there were a lot of people, including me, who were worried that, we were looking at the dawn of rightist hegemony in Japan. That actually didn't happen. But what Abe did succeed in doing was, because you could argue the sugar high of the monetary stimulus that Governor Kuroda administered to the Japanese economy. The LDP won the upper house elections in 2013, which gave Abe the political space that he needed to do things, to turn his attention to security policies and so forth. So the economy was drained of its political potential, the political potential to damage Abe. I think that Abe expected and planned. It wasn't that the 2020 Olympics, which had been scheduled for Tokyo, would do for the Japanese economy what the 1964 Tokyo Olympics had done for Japan, which is to provide an enormous macroeconomic boost as well as a boost to national pride and so forth. And Abe, like everybody else, was completely blindsided by COVID. And so rather than go out in a blaze of glory with an economy partly stimulated by the enormous amounts of spending that the Tokyo Olympics would have brought in their wake if they had been scheduled, if they'd gone ahead as originally planned, he dithered for several months. What do? He kept hoping that there would be some sort of solution to the virus, and which ultimately emerged, but it was too late. And so he finally resigned in 2000. When did he resign? I guess it was in the spring of 2020 when it became clear that the Olympics were going to have to be postponed. Had he not been assassinated, he would have continued to be a very important player. Japanese retired politicians are often more powerful in retirement than they are when they're actually in control. And shortly before he was killed, he did voice some opposition to the Ministry of Finance's single-minded devotion to raising the consumption tax, which suggests that had he lived, he might have been able to influence through his deshis, the Japanese word, his followers in the government. He might have been able to enact finally the stimulus policies, but he was killed. So we don't know. That question we'll never answer. But I would say that in terms of what he hoped to achieve overall, it's not entirely a failure.
What did he succeed?
I'm sorry?
Where did he succeed?
Well, he succeeded, first of all, as I say, in preventing the economy from becoming a politically damaging to the current power alignments. I mean, again, the events of 2000.
But that may be a plus for the LDP, but that's not necessarily a plus for the Japanese economy.
Oh, for sure, yeah. But I mean, the events of 2008, 2009, when the LDP lost its control over Japanese politics because of the economy. The economy was the reason.
Right.
And it was obvious to everyone that the traditional provisions that for economic security were no longer working. And in that sense, you could say that Abe was a success in that he ensured that wouldn't happen again. I mean, so he was, but the only tool that he was actually able to use is monetary policy. And monetary policy only works for a while, as we're seeing right now, because, I mean, now that Kuroda was able to do what he did, in part because of the global environment. Everybody was cutting interest rates to nothing, with the Fed, the European Central Bank, whatever. They were all cutting interest rates. So Kuroda was able to flood the Japanese economy with money and maintain what was effectively a negative interest rate policy. That's not possible anymore, and we're seeing the results of that in the foreign exchange markets, where the yen is now below 150, and that's actually very dangerous. That's not good news for Japan. Yen that is that weak.
지금 머피 선생님이 말씀하시는 것을 조금 더 그 컨텍스트를 말씀을 드리면 그 사람의 출신은 재무성 출신입니다. 그 사람이 들어오고 난 다음에 무엇을 했냐면 여러분도 들어올 때 양적 완화라는 걸 했어요. 결국은 무엇을 했냐면은 일본의 국채를 일본 은행이 이제 사기 시작한 겁니다. 엄청나게 샀어요. 미국의 페더럴 리저브가 미국 국채를 산 거랑은 상대적인 규모에서는 비교가 안 되게 샀습니다. 예를 들면 페더럴 리저브가 양적 완화를 통해서 미국 국채를 샀을 때 최고로 갔을 때의 사이즈가 8에서 9 트릴리언입니다. 달러로. 근데 미국의 경제는 21, 22 트릴리언입니다. 그러면 3분의 1 정도 되죠. 일본은 경제가 한 5 트릴리언 정도 됩니다. 그런데 일본 은행의 밸런스시이 6조 달러가 됩니다. 그러니까 자기 GDP보다 더 클 정도로 산 것이고 그 중에 약 4빌리언이 일본의 국채를 샀어요. 그래서 지금은 일본이 발행한 전체 국채의 반을 일본 은행이 갖고 있습니다. 이 엄청난 숫자이죠. 근데 그렇게 해서 이제 말하자면은 이제 머니를 이제 플러딩을 했다라는 얘기인데 문제는 그렇게 센트럴 뱅크가 국채를 다 사놓고 어떡할 거냐? 지금 말씀하신 것처럼 다른 나라도 금리가 낮을 때는 괜찮은데 다른 나라가 이제 금리가 올라가면 그러면 일본 국채는 같이 금리를 올리면 부채에 의해서 이자를 많이 내야 되니까 일이 생기잖아요. 그러니까 금리를 빨리 올릴 수가 없습니다. 그럼 금리를 올릴 수 없으니까 어떻게 되느냐? 일본 엔화가 올라가는 거죠. 값이 환율이. 그래서 지금 150년이 됐지 않습니까? 근데 지금 머피 선생님은 그 150년 되는 그 식으로 그렇게 소위 말해 평가절하가 이렇게 심하게 되는 것도 일본 경제에는 좋은 건 아니다. 이제 그렇게 지금 그 얘기를 이제 하시는 겁니다. 근데 이렇게 150엔까지 되는 이것이 일본에 어떻게 안 좋다는 말씀이신가요?
Well, it, among other things, it makes it a problem if there is to be any repeat of what happened to Japan in 2011, when the earthquake and the tsunami, which destroyed the nuclear power plant, and Japan took its entire nuclear power plants offline, and was suddenly forced onto global energy markets to make up that difference, because nuclear power had been providing about 1/3 of Japan's energy requirements. If the yen had not been strong at that point, it would have been very bad for Japan. In a world of today, where energy prices, the upward pressures on energy prices are relentless, coming both from events like the wars in the Middle East and in Ukraine, and also just simply from dwindling fossil fuel sources. This imposes a large burden on Japan, and it accelerates the coming of the day which the Ministry of Finance has long feared, where not just the Ministry of Finance, but other observers, where Japan will be unable to finance its fiscal deficit without borrowing from foreigners. The yen has served since the yen stabilized. After the yen was quite strong before Abe came to power. In fact, it was, from the standpoint of many Japanese corporations, it was too strong because it was affecting their exports. And one reason that Kuroda's policies were in the short term successful, as measured, for example, by the rise of the Tokyo stock market and the sense in Japan that Japan was recovering, was that he had steered the yen to a more comfortable level. And there are analysts, and I tend to agree with them, that a yen somewhere around 113 to 115 to the dollar is a natural rate. It reflects the natural competitiveness of the Japanese economy via the U.S. economy and other economies, its peer economies. That the yen remained in that stable zone until the coming of COVID and the flooding of the world's economies with money to recover from COVID. And during that time, the yen was effectively the only hedging currency available to central bankers and other investors in
I'm
portfolios.
afraid you are getting too technical. Yeah.
I'm sorry about that, but yeah. Well, what I mean by that is that if you wanted to invest in a foreign currency, if you were a central banker, for example, you don't want to invest wholly in dollars. How do you protect yourself against dollar weakness? Well, the euro is the world's #2 currency, but after the problems of 2008, 2009, when it looked as if there was talk actually of the euro falling apart, of Italy leaving the euro group and so forth, the euro bloc, the yen became the favored backup currency, and that has disappeared with the yen at 150. People are no longer. Well, the investors around the world are no longer. They're too fearful.
But it's not Japan's problem.
I'm sorry?
It's not Japan's problem.
Well, it isn't Japan's problem, except that it could be. It could be. I mean, you get to the point where, as I say, I mean, now I'm repeating myself now, but a weak yen tends to feed on itself. And so much in the sense that, it raises Japan's energy bills to excessively high levels. It accelerates the day that Japan may be running a current account deficit, or be unable to finance its fiscal deficit without reliance on foreigners. So the other point is that historically, I mean, if you go back, to the great years, the golden years of the Japanese economy, the weak yen was regarded, and properly so, as an important advantage for Japan because it made their exports so much more competitive. But if you look at Japanese corporations today, many of their products are no longer made in Japan. They're made in other countries. And so a weak yen doesn't necessarily increase the profitability of Japanese industry the way it did back 2 generations ago. I mean, it may very well be that this is a natural corrective. I mean, you could argue, and some have, that with the yen at 150, that Japan you'll see a repatriation of investment from places like China back to Japan. So I mean, it could be a self-correcting situation, but it certainly has alarmed the financial authorities in Japan. It's considered too weak. They consider it too weak, and I think a lot of impartial observers would consider it too weak, dangerously weak.
이 말씀을 들으면서 이제 생각나는 것은 뭐냐면 그 환율이 그렇게 높아지면 수출이 뭐 좋아질 것 같은 생각도 들지만 또 한편으로는 수입품의 가격이 올라가서 일본의 인플레이션이 올라가겠죠. 인플레이션이 올라간다는 것에는 두 가지 의미가 있을 수 있는 것 같아요. 하나는 일본 정부가 그토록 원하던 디플레이션이 끝나고 인플레이션으로 원하지 않았는데도 좋은 면이 있을 수 있고, 또 한편으로는 그렇기 때문에 일본 국민들은 그만큼 자기네들이 물가가 올라서 고생이 될 수도 있는 거죠. 그러니까 이게 말하자면 매크로 이코노믹스를 얘기를 할 때 나중에 가면은 좀 재미가 없어지는 게 뭐냐면 뭐가 하나 이렇게 올라가고 내려가는 게 꼭 좋은 게 아닙니다. 전체적인 균형이 맞는 것이 제일 중요한데, 또 그렇게 균형이 중요합니다 말하면 또 너무 재미가 없어요. 그러니까 이거 이렇게 된다 이렇게 말을 해야 되는데, 근데 어떻게 보면은 아까 말씀을 다시 돌아가면은 아베의 경우는 아베가 소위 양적 완화를 통해서 일본 경제를 조금은 어느 정도 소위 말하면 이제 2010년에 민주당이 집권을 할 때 생겼던 그런 경제 그 문제로부터 좀 벗어나면서 어떻게 보기에는 일본이 웰페어 스테이트로 가는 길목이 도리어 막혔고 덕분에 LDP는 자기네들의 파워를 더 공고화할 수 있었을지는 모르지만 보기에 따라서는 일본의 새로운 패스를 새로운 노선을 시험할 수 있는 기회를 일본이 또다시 10년 동안 잃어버렸다고 말할 수도 있는 건 아닐까 뭐 그런 생각을 좀 해봤습니다. 한국 제가 이 말씀을 드리는 이유는 지금 한국도 잘 보시면 들어보시면 일본의 재장성은 그 많은 30년에 거친 스태그네이션을 거쳐서 여전히 어떻게 하면은 피지컬 밸런스를 할 거냐라는 것에 지금 몰두가 돼 있잖아요. 그 사람들의 넘버원 잡이 그것이기 때문에 그렇습니다. 한국도 지금 재경부의 넘버원 프라이어티는 어떻게 하면은 재정 적자를 줄일 거냐라는 이슈잖아요. 그래서 경기가 나빠지는 것은 그 다음 일인 거예요. 그러니까 이제 일본에서 경기가 조금만 좋아지면 컨섬션 텍스로 돌아가면서 경기 나빠지고 밖에서 볼 때는 도대체 일본이 왜 저렇게 컨섬션 텍스를 갖고 20년 동안 드글드글 싸울까를 생각하게 되는데 지금 설명하시는 것은 조금 이해가 되는데 제가 보기엔 한국은 지금 텍스를 올리는 쪽으로 재경부가 가지 않고 어떻게 갑니까? 긴축으로 가잖아요. 그러니까 기본적인 그러니까 그들의 걱정은 똑같습니다. 그런데 일본은 그것을 텍스를 올려서 커버를 하려고 하는 쪽으로 20년간 시도를 하고 있고 한국의 재경부는 계속해서 지출을 줄이는 쪽으로 해결을 하려고 한다라는 것이 차이가 나지만 근본적으로는 똑같은 문제를 갖고 있는 것이 아닌가 그런 생각이 듭니다.
주진영 선생님.
네, 끝내야 되는군요.
네, 그렇습니다.
끝낼게요. 이거는 그 마지막 두 가지 원래 하려던 질문은 이제 그렇게 그 양적 완화를 하면서 한 가지 제가 말씀 안 드리는 것은 뭐냐면 일본의 중앙은행이 현재 일본의 주식의 약 850빌리언 달러를 갖고 있습니다. 지분으로 치면은 일본의 주식시장에서 가장 큰 주주예요. 근데 여기에 대해서 여쭤보려고 했는데 그거를 그냥 넘어가겠습니다. 근데 제가 보기에는 우리나라도 그런 꼴 벌어질 것이 가능하다고 생각을 하는데 그보다 이제 마지막 질문을 드리면 그래서 지금 일본은 어떻게 밖에서 보면은 당장 망할 것 같으면서도 그런 대로 버텨내요. 옛날에는 상상도 못했던 150%, 200%가 넘는 가버먼 데트를 갖고 있고 물론 그 중에 반은 센트럴 뱅크가 지금 갖고 있을 거는 그놈이지만 그러면서도 어쨌든 간에 버텨내거든요. 보시기에 2014년 책을 쓰시고 난 다음에 지금 8년이 지난 지금 지난 10년만을 돌이켜 보실 때 또는 앞으로 일본을 보실 때 지금 일본의 경제는 어디에 와 있고 앞으로 어디로 갈 거라고 보시는지 그것을 여쭤보고 싶습니다. 그리고 마지막으로는 그 과정을 통해서 한국이 일본의 경제 성장 또는 운영 모델을 그대로 베껴온 한국은 일본이 하는 행동에서 우리가 무엇을 배워야 되는지 그것을 좀 여쭤보고 싶습니다.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, it's always dangerous to make predictions. The Japanese do have a remarkable capacity for muddling through. I think, and I would guess that they will, if I had to take bets, I would say based on history, that they will probably continue to muddle through. They have, I ask myself sometimes, or I ask my Japanese friends, I mean, if you were, given the choice of dealing with Japan's problems or dealing with the problems of other major developed countries, which would you take? Do you want to deal with Germany's problems? Do you want to deal with Britain's problems? Even do you want to deal with America's problems? or do you want to deal with Japan's problems? When you put it that way, Japan doesn't look so bad. I mean, among other things, you don't, you have a high degree of social cohesion, which is a very real advantage when you need to muddle through. The great challenge to muddling through, of course, is external events. I mean, we saw the last huge financial challenge was, of course, the events of 2008, 2009, which led to something fairly close to a political upheaval in Japan. We may see something like that again. Who knows? We could. Also, it's linked now, economic security is so linked with an increasingly unstable global security situation. So whether Japan will be able to survive that, or survive that unchallenged is an open question. So as I say, I think muddling through is probably what I would bet. I would say is the most likely scenario. Now, the last part of your question was, what can Korea learn from Japan? I mean, I often say that it should be the other way around. What Japan should learn from Korea, because the Korean response to recent events is over the last third generation has in some ways been superior. And I asked a Korean friend of mine who had spent a long time in Japan, why was Korea able to rally so well after the 1997-98 crisis, whereas Japan, continues to just, these problems just seem they're perennial, and we could have had this session in 1990, and we'd be almost going through the same sorts of things, and his answer is very interesting. He says, well, basically, we didn't have any choice. I mean, things were so bad in 1998 that we didn't have any choice in the matter. We had to take the necessary steps, even though they were politically unpopular and they were painful. So you could argue that Korea should perhaps look to its own strengths in that, rather than try to look at Japan. I mean, Japan historically has done very well when it's up against an existential challenge. But the last existential challenge, to really existential challenge the Japanese economic model, was actually in the mid-70s, the time of the energy crisis, 1974. And they came through that with flying colors. I hate to say that the reform of the Japanese economy, real reform of the Japanese economy, depends on another existential challenge like that. But I suspect that I would hope that they could deal with it. I mean, there's another problem which both societies, both Japan and Korea, face. I was talking about that with a friend who's one of the best, closest observers of the German, who's a very astute observer of the Japanese economy. And I was saying, well, look what the Japanese did in the Meiji period. And he said, yes, the Iwakura mission. Most of you probably have heard of the Iwakura mission. This was a mission that was sent in the 1860s by, to go around the world to study from what other major countries were doing. He said the average age of the Iwakura mission was 25 years. And what's the average age in Japan? This is an old country. It's demographically an aging country, and older people. I mean, we're
Speak about yourself.
Speak for myself, right? But we want to preserve what we have rather than be willing to take risks. And so I guess that's one thing that both countries really need to turn their attention to, is how to address the demographic challenge. Because, well, I guess that would be one great...
One number that I keep to myself and are very afraid to share with others, this is the first time I'm sharing with you, is that traditionally, for the last 30 or 40 years, 일본의 출산 아의 숫자는 한국의 출산화에 비해서 2.5배였습니다. 근데 최근 들어서는 그것이 3.2배로 늘었어요. 일본이 더 많이 낳는 겁니다. 이게 과거에는 일본에서 아이가 2.5명이 날 수는 없죠, 그렇죠? 잘라서 날 수는 없으니까 어쨌든 간에 2.5명이 태어날 때 한국에서는 한 명의 아이가 태어났어요. 근데 지금은 일본에서 3.2명이 태어날 때 한국에 한 명이 태어납니다. 그러니까 이 데모그래피, 그러니까 인구학적인 문제는 이게 잘 보시면요. 일본은 90년 초에 버블을 꺼지면서 많은 변화를 겪으면서 이제 스태그네이션으로 갔다고 하지만 한국은 97년에 겪고 그 이후에 다시 국내의 대출을 계속해서 늘려가면서 경제 성장률을 유지했는데 그 결과 지금 남고 보니 우리는 아이를 일본보다도 안 낳는 나라가 되었다는 거예요. 이것이 물론 많은 문제, 많은 요인이 작용을 하는 거지만 하다못해 일본 사람들은 적어도 집 걱정은 안 하는데 한국 사람은 여전히 부동산 버블에 대한 집 걱정을 하고 일본보다는 훨씬 더 국민들이 갈라서 싸우고 있고 그러니까 어떻게 보면 이게 누가 형인지 누가 동생인지 잘 모르겠어요, 저는요. 선생님께서는 지금 어떤 면에서는 한국이 낫다고 얘기도 하시지만 저는 사실은 BTC 보이밴드 10개 만들어봐라 나라가 제대로 되나 뭐 그런 생각도 드는데 네, 선생님 긴 시간 동안 좋은 말씀을 해주셨고요.
더 아쉬움이 있으시겠지만 오늘은 여기까지 진행을 하도록 하겠습니다. 오늘의 특별한 대담회를 이끌어주신 생활토목비 교수님과 주진영 선생님께 큰 박수 부탁드립니다.